I want to introduce our consultants that are here with us. First is Brad Davis. He's with Alta, who was one of the principals on the study, as well as Gabe Klein. And Gabe is the founder of Citywide, which is an urban think tank. And also, he was former commissioner of transportation for both Chicago and Washington, D.C. So, and Gabe's going to join in the presentation in just a minute. Let me tee it up first. We're talking about the downtown West Palm Beach mobility strategy, and with the exception, I know the new commissioners, I know they were at meetings, but they haven't been through all this, so we're just going to go quickly through introduction to it. Why mobility? Why did we do this study? It's to make sure that we can improve safety and congestion throughout our city. And we also did a deep dive on Okeechobee because that seems to be a focus of a lot of attention. So we did a deep dive there. How can we grow the city and improve the quality of life? And how do all these previous plans and projects and stuff that we've done, how do they all fit together in an integrated program? So these are the things that were important to us. We did a planning process that I'll go into in a minute. And now we're talking about moving forward. What do we do for the next 20 years? What are we trying to accomplish? And what we're trying to do is support growth in our city. We know growth is going to occur, but we want it to be safe. We want it to be reliable. We want it to be, and I think Gabe's going to talk about the fact, we want it to be fun. We want people to enjoy transportation instead of it being a drudgery. So how did we get here? In the spring of 17, we had workshops, envisioning, and we did all the background work. We made recommendations in the summer, and we came and actually made some presentations to the commission, in fact. And now we're in the implementation action plan phase that we put a plan together this last fall, and now we're ready to present it and roll it up and start actionable items and start getting going on that. So, as I mentioned, we ended up doing public meetings. We had more than 600 participants during Okeechobee Charrette last spring. It was very well attended. We had great comments. We incorporated them into the plan. We did online engagement. We had a lot of hits on this, a lot of suggestions. You could go online and make suggestions about improvements in our city. And then we did stakeholder meetings. We've done more than 30 stakeholder meetings. So it's been a lot of outreach involved with this. There's multiple component parts to this. I'm excited because we've actually done what I consider the most comprehensive mobility plan perhaps in the country, at least in Florida, in regard to pulling all the elements together, whether that be a citywide bike master plan. We've studied specific corridors downtown, but also downtown parking and transportation demand management. Very few mobility plans that you're going to find out there that have been done actually include that element, which is critical if we're going to be successful overall. So it rolls up into an overall strategy that we're going to ask now to implement. So the overall plan, we're looking at a 20-year investment strategy, both on programs, plans, and projects. We want to lay out a framework for mode shift. We want to shift away from single passenger occupancy vehicles where we can. We're looking at all modes of transportation, and we're anticipating growth both in residents, jobs, visitors within our city, and so we want to be prepared for that growth and quality of life, certainly. If you look at the Okeechobee Boulevard, where we really drilled down, we've come up with a series of short, medium, and long-term strategies to improve that corridor. We want to make, first and foremost, the corridor safer and easier for people to cross that corridor, because we hear all about that all the time, and our future depends on that. We want traffic options. We want to look at different modes, but most importantly, we want to create predictability and reliability that will also result in safety as people are traveling that corridor. It's very important. We've never said that we're going to make it faster. We're going to make it more predictable, more enjoyable, more reliable. so that people will end up being able to project. If you're, for instance, if you want to come downtown, it'll be you'll be able to project the time travel that you'll have in order to be able to traverse that corridor. We want to downtown parking and transportation demand management study. So we're coming up with a strategy, may result in additional revenue, and we've heard that, like, oh, this is a way for the city to make more money. No. If we do get additional revenue, we're going to invest it right back into the downtown. We're talking about the best use for that money would be to enhance our trolley system. We want to increase convenience and accessibility of parking downtown. Sometimes people feel like this is counterintuitive, but if you do the proper strategies, it actually increases accessibility and increases convenience, because you have less cruising of people trying to find a spot. And for our visitors, there's accessibility and convenience, and this is what our surveys have shown that they really want. We want to increase walkability. We've talked about that. We've talked about shade. We've talked about widening sidewalks. And we want to improve customer service in regard to our parking. We just kicked off a program to improve the parking experience. We all know our parking garages are safe, but there's a perception that they're not, and we're going to change that, because we're going to make sure that perception meets up with the reality of it.
And we're changing that by putting parking attendants throughout.
Exactly. We're increasing security, more parking attendants, better lighting, all the things that make it to improve the perception and also the experience for our parkers. And then last, which is not least, we're going to implement technology. There's technology options out there now that we need to implement, and we need to really advance our parking. We don't want to be on the cutting edge of some of those technologies, because you always, there's always problems that you experience when you're on the cutting edge, but we certainly want to be progressive in application of technology so that it makes it easier for people to be able to find a parking space and be able to pay for their parking, and all these things that technology now allows us to do. And finally, our citywide master plan for bike. We're going to do over 100 miles of connected bicycle facilities. I mean, that's dramatic. I mean, we're going from very few to a very well-connected, gridded system for biking, which is going to really be a game changer for people that would like to bike downtown but don't feel comfortable today biking from the neighborhoods. And we're also going to connect neighborhoods together, schools, parks, all those type of facilities, that we have a connected network that's safe for people to be able to bike. And whether you're a child or whether you're even an elderly person, that you'll feel safe being able to traverse those streets. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabe, who's going to really give us some experiences, because we're kind of focused here on West Palm all the time, and I think it's really important that we bring somebody in that talks about what's happening around the world, what's happening around the country, and how other municipal entities have been successful in implementing policies that we're espousing in this study.
Thanks.
Welcome, Gabe. We're glad to see you again.
Thank you,
Welcome back to West Palm.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I've had a bunch of conversations this morning. We talked this morning. Brad and I were talking. I'm really, really proud of this plan. Brad and I were just across the street, and I said, one of the great things about this is it was such a team effort. There were 5 firms that Alta led on this, and everybody was listened to. Internally, our firms were listened to. The public was listened to. I don't know if I've ever been to meetings where 250 to 300 people showed up to contribute productively. I think over the last year, we've come a long way in terms of educating people and also educating ourselves based on what the people are telling us about what they want and the fact that transportation is not really about transportation. It's about connectivity and mobility. And we think we want to get from point A to point B as fast as humanly possible. But there's so much more to it. And when you look at the menu of strategies and benefits, there's a reason why it's far-ranging. We need carrots and sticks, and we need many more carrots if we want to get people excited about the change that's coming to West Palm Beach. The good news about this plan is that it's based on best practices from all around the world. And my opinion is that, whether West Palm Beach is a giant city or a small city, that doesn't matter. People want the same quality of life no matter where they are, and I would argue that the quality of life here is much better than in New York City and a lot of other big cities. And one of the things we were talking about also this morning is that you're going to see huge growth. Like some of the people that are like, well, I don't know if I want to change. And there's that situation everywhere. The reality is that West Palm Beach is going to grow dramatically. So it's a matter of how do we shape that growth, right? How do we drive the change that keeps West Palm a beautiful, wonderful, resilient, equitable, sustainable place that where people are happy. So with that, I'm just going to touch on, this is my favorite slide of all time. I'm going to talk about dispelling some myths, because on top of sharing best practices, I really want to also talk about how we communicate with people, all of our stakeholders, in terms of what we're trying to do. And a lot of times we think that, like the bus is this heavily subsidized mode of transportation. It's a welfare program, it's a social program. Actually, the car is the social program. And we've just gotten in the habit in this country of subsidizing the automobile. And it's subsidized about 6 times more than the bus. Because we take it for granted that you have all these sunk costs when you buy a car. You don't think that it's costing you $1,000 a month. You don't think that that's money you can't spend on other things. We also don't think about the fact that when you drive your car, like I could have taken a Lyft or an Uber over from the Hilton this morning, and it would have been the exact same time. I looked at Google Maps as walking. But if I take an Uber, I'm not getting any of the health benefits. So when you look at this, walking and biking throw off profit to the system. And that's something that we don't think about typically. So why would we want to take money and invest in transit, whether it's more trolley service, whether it's reevaluating how PalmTran runs with Jarrett Walker and looking at operating the service differently with higher frequency, fewer routes? Because what matters is the return on investment. So I would tell people that it's not about how much you spend, it's about how much you get out of what you spend. And there's a difference between spending and investing in your future. And investing in transit, done the right way, can be very, very impactful. In Phoenix, which I think is a great example, they were so successful with their initial line segment of 10 miles that the public, and this is in a relatively conservative place, decided to tax themselves to the tune of actually $31.2 billion to invest in a light rail system throughout Phoenix. And again, as they build it out and they measure before and after, they continue to see huge impacts, huge positive economic impacts, as well as sustainability impacts, getting people out of their cars, more tight development around these transit nodes. And that's something that we've talked about over the last year. If people are going to work in West Palm, we want them to live in West Palm. We don't want them to have to drive from far away. And if we can get more people living close to work, it'll free up road space for those that do want to drive from far away or have to and don't have that choice.
Gabe, I saw some comments on Facebook over the weekend about density, and and you said if people are going to work in West Palm, they should live in West Palm. For us, it's almost the opposite. We have more people living here, but the jobs and the places for jobs aren't existing, like the office spaces and so they could actually live and work in downtown.
Well, Mayor, that's right. Like, you need to have mixed use. So if you just build housing, you're not going to be successful. If you just build office, you won't be successful. You want mixed use development where people can live, work, and play, and be able to literally walk or bike to everything within 5 or 10 minutes in an ideal situation. One of the things that I also love about this plan, and this was some input that I think we had early on with Alta, is we've got to have short, medium, and long-term plans. And so not everything has to be a giant construction project. And you'll see there's some great projects in there that can be done quickly, like this project that we did in Chicago to make an intersection considerably safer, but also beautify it. And that's something that West Palm Beach has actually done a great job with over the last few years. So you'll see more of that. Once we show people the change, maybe in a cheap way, then you can come back and really do the expensive version once people have bought into it. So that's a nice way to bring people with you, and that's in the plan to do things like this. The other thing that I think is super important that is embedded in the plan is this idea that streets have to be complete. And we had a conversation this morning about congestion, and people say, I don't want any congestion. Well, congestion is actually a sign of a very successful downtown. Now, of course, you want the right type of congestion. And somebody wrote, when we had notepads up here during one of our charrettes, somebody wrote, widen the sidewalks on Clematis and get rid of parking. Now, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't do that, but I just found it interesting because if we're congested with pedestrians, that's not a bad thing, right? It's if we're congested with cars that are sitting spewing out fumes that people get frustrated. So this idea that we need to embed complete streets in everything that we do, as we did in Chicago. This was in the heart of our downtown, very controversial. You're going to take away 2 lanes, you're going to put in a bus lane, a platform, a protected bike lane. But we have to embrace this. We have to actually act on this plan now, and we have to institutionalize these changes so that every street that gets rebuilt is a complete street, as we did in Chicago. And when we talk to people about mixing traffic versus segregating traffic, and you'll see this in the plan too, we want to create, 17 miles of bikeways pretty quickly. On local streets, it's not that you need to have a protected bike lane on a local street. We need to slow traffic down, and we might go to 20 miles per hour to slow traffic down so that everybody can mix safely, right? Whereas on a busy arterial street, you may want to separate people because you can't slow people down that much. And it's important that we talk to people in these very fundamental sort of basic ways that they can understand. If you got a 20,000 pound bus passing by you, you may want to be in a separated bike lane. And if you give the bus its own lane, people might use it because it's more reliable and it goes faster. And if we increase the frequency, and who knows, we make it free someday, well, like the trolley, people might take it a whole lot more. So these are examples of the carrots that we can give people to make them excited about the options that we want to put in front of them. But we do have to make physical changes to the street, and that can be hard. That can be hard. But nothing easy is worth doing, and when you do the hard things, you see the bigger rewards. I want to talk a little bit about parking, because I know that it is a sensitive topic everywhere, but definitely here too. And I think what people don't understand sometimes is that we are creating an affordability crisis in our cities by building too much parking. So the typical 2-bedroom in the United States averages $800. And when you build an underground parking space, as we often do, it goes to $1,300, which is a 62.5% increase. Never mind that the developer actually has to subsidize that parking space because they typically can't recoup their investment. So we are seeing a big paradigm shift worldwide and here in bigger cities and soon in smaller cities around building less parking, creating more affordable housing. And it's getting worse and worse and worse.
Excuse me, Gabe, we have a question.
Yes.
Commissioner James?
Thank you. Before you move, thank you, Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Before you move too far off of the complete streets topic, you kind of threw it out there as if it was a gospel, but I need you to walk us through why must we do complete streets?
Okay, great. Safety is the biggest reason. If we don't create complete streets, we won't create communities in place. Okay, so I actually wish, I like to throw up old pictures of what your city used to look like. If you looked at pictures of West Palm Beach around the turn of the last century, you'd see people all in the streets, kids playing, right? And we had flight out of our cities, right, in the 60s for lots of reasons. And cities became throughways for high-speed traffic. And often people of less means got stuck in the city, and the wealthy people got to move out to the suburbs and then cruise through the city. And our culture changed in our cities. So what we're trying to do now is go back to what we had before in many ways and create a place where people actually want to be, where kids actually could play in the street in a downtown if they wanted to, where it's not just about moving traffic, but it's actually about moving people and sustaining people. And so we lose 40,000 people a year right now to death on our roadways. Florida is the worst state in the union, unfortunately, with I think Tampa and Orlando and Jacksonville being amongst the worst. And it's because of poor street design. That's the number one reason. We don't want to accept that, and we often sort of fight against changing the street because we think that if we take a lane away from a car, then what's going to happen is we're going to make it slower to get to work. And what the data shows and the science shows, and I always like to joke, I still believe in data and science, is that when you add extra capacity, you actually clog up the road more because you send people a message to drive, instead of actually shrinking the road down and then giving people more options, which is what you'll see in a lot of these examples. If we always think, well, if you take a lane away, you're going to have the same number of cars, right? It's just going to be in a constricted capacity, then of course that doesn't work. But if you think, oh, we take a lane away, but then we get 20% mode shift over to the bus, 10% mode shift over to bikes, it works itself out. But it takes that first step. The first step is the hardest, where you take a big street like Madison and you say, hey, we're going to take 2 lanes away that were car lanes. And people are like, ugh. And you got to take a little political risk, and you got to do it. And you have to do it well. And there's technology that's used for signalization and other things to make it flow better, because our streets are not optimized very well.
I'm sorry, one more question.
No, please.
Thank you. One of the points of the making it safer is that when you shrink it down to 1 lane, the cars traveling on that 1 lane are traveling. They become through cars, and you move the road in a way that the cars making a left and making a right get out of the flow of traffic, and 1, it makes it safer because it reduces accidents, and 2, it increases capacity. I mean, I think we've had this conversation many times with our impact fees with the county. If we make our roads safer, we're building capacity, and then we argue whether or not the impact fees build capacity by making the road safer. But I think that that's a distinction that's worth talking about, because people get caught up in this, oh my God, they don't even think beyond the current situation that they live in. Oh, you're planning to move in the future to transit, or you're planning to move in the future to buses, but it makes an immediate, impactful difference. And I just wanted to make that point.
Absolutely.
Well, and it slows traffic down. I mean, if you just think about when we had closed the 2 lanes in Flagler, how slowly traffic went down Flagler. And if you go there now and watch the cars speed up and down, it's a significant difference.
Absolutely. And there's what's called a standard road diet, where you take those 4-lane roads, 2-way couplets, and you make them 1 lane in each direction with a bike lane, and then a reversible turn lane in the middle. It's been very successful in actually increasing throughput by going from 4 lanes to 2. But by adding that flexible turn lane in the middle, it works better for cars, and it's much safer for pedestrians, and the cyclists have a place to be. So the idea is to create win-win-wins, not to penalize people for driving. But the thing is, people, if they don't have any other options, they're just going to keep driving. And parking is part of it. So we have freeways, right? They're called freeways because they're free. And then we have parking. And if we make parking free or low cost, then people will drive. It's really that simple. Because we're human beings. We take the path of least resistance. And then culturally, we think that that's acceptable and that's what we should do. So we need to adjust our pricing to reflect what we actually want people to do. Now, that's thought of as a stick. But the reality is we should just be pricing the right-of-way for what it's worth as well. Talk very quickly about some examples from all over in terms of shared mobility, frictionless apps and things of that nature that we can bring here to West Palm Beach. This is Paris. They adopted a very large-scale bike sharing system in 2007. Then they launched Autolib, which is based on Volib, the bike system. And they've got scooter sharing now, bike taxis, basically every bit of shared mobility you can imagine they have there. And people are really just not buying cars anymore. And when you don't buy a car, by the way, it frees up a lot of money to invest in other things like education and healthcare, to spend at retail stores in your local area. We are bankrupting people, particularly poor people, by forcing them into buying cars. In Washington, D.C., where I live, east of the river, which is predominantly African American community, people are spending up to 53% of their income on transportation. But we are forcing that on them because they are living in a transit desert. Move Seattle, this is a project that we worked on. And the idea here is to create a vision and then a sandbox, right? So for public and private experimentation. So you could bring electric scooters here, right? You could bring all-in-one apps here. You could bring dockless bike share. There's lots of different options, and you don't have to do it all. You create a sandbox, you create the opportunity for the private sector to come in and a framework to test things, then you can scale them. Helsinki is actually doing an incredible job of making the government the central arbiter for all the different options, public and private, and then not really picking winners or losers. But they do run the app for the entire system. And it's frictionless and easy, and this is what we call TDM. It's like advanced TDM, Transportation Demand Management. It covers all of your journeys. It's very simple to use, and there's one way to pay, and you can opt in. So you can say, I just want to pay as I go, or I want a plan, or I want all-you-can-eat mobility. And this is where we're heading as a society. Basically, ownership of transportation is virtually dead, and sharing transportation is the future in any urban context. And it's not that we're going to do that, it's that the private sector is bringing it. But the government can facilitate it, and it can happen more quickly. And this is a very interesting model. They're expanding to other countries now, and there are opportunities with systems like this in the United States to do that here. Washington, D.C., I think, is an interesting example. Sorry, the slide's a little off here. But we started slowly layering on transportation options, one after another, after another, after another. And we invite basically any private sector option that comes to the fore. We have 7 companies now providing scooters and bike share, in addition to our own huge bike share system. We've got Split and Uber and Lyft and Car2Go and Zipcar. And we've become basically like this giant sandbox. And we learned that with the different options, different populations will use them. We saw it with Capital Bike Share. We saw more like affluent people using it. With Dockless, we're finding everybody's using it in all areas of the city. And part of the reason is that it's completely free floating. And so this is an example, of, I think, of providing as many options as possible for people and then letting them make the choices. But then raising prices on parking, making it a little bit harder to drive in the city, and pushing them towards the right behavior.
When I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, I saw lots of people on those electric scooters.
They're everywhere.
Yes, that seems to be the next mode of transportation.
That just launched literally a couple months ago, and it's taking over our streets. And it's funny because over the last year, as I've been here, I've been talking to everybody about Singapore, because it's tropical and they have some of the same issues around walking and biking. I didn't even think that these scooters are everywhere there. And what a great option for people here. They're tiny, they're easy to use, you don't sweat, you get a little bit of exercise, and you get people out of cars. We also work a lot in Los Angeles, and I'm not going to go into detail because I'm out of time. But the idea here is to align policies and actions with pilots, and that's again what we are doing here. We're not picking winners or losers, but we're creating a lot of options for people and letting them choose. One of the most interesting things that came out of this LA program is this idea of transportation happiness. So again, we think, I want to get from here to there as fast as possible. So again, I could have taken a car from the Hilton over here, but I walked and I felt energized when I got here, albeit a little bit sweaty. But the idea is we need to start measuring with metrics and communicating to people about the quality of their trip, not just the speed of their trip. And it relates to the infrastructure on the street. Because in an urban context, right, let's say you cut the speed limit from 25 to 20. Is it going to slow people down? Yes. Will it affect the throughput of traffic? No. And if anything, it'll enhance it because you'll have fewer accidents. Accidents and construction in the right-of-way are the #1 causes of congestion. So it's not about speed in an urban area. It's about quality of throughput and quality of the trip. And if everybody in this room walked or biked everywhere, you wouldn't need a gym membership. Trust me. The last thing I want to talk about is data. So for all of the experiments that we do, whether they be changing our right-of-way, bringing in new transportation options, we want to measure how do things look before, during, and after. So it's important that when a new company comes in, a scooter company, or we take a lane away, we either collect data or we demand that we get data from these companies. So that we can see on Quadrille, when we go from this to this and people say, oh no, you know, we've lost a lane, I feel it's really congested, we can say, well, actually, here's what the data shows. And by the way, this can be a temporary installation, so you can show people what it looks like, and then you can come back with a full reconstruction when funding allows, or when the street needs to be reconstructed anyway. Anyway, there's lots more to talk about, but that was just a primer of what's in the plan and why it's important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me wrap this up with talking about next steps for plans and projects. As you can see, as I mentioned earlier, that we're breaking this down into bite-sized pieces, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And you can see it's quite ambitious. Our projects and programs that we plan on putting in place. I won't go over all of them, but it involves applications of tracking trolleys, safety improvements, specifically most important on Okeechobee, signal timing, and I want to mention that we're working together with the county as well as the town of Palm Beach, DOT, the TPA, as well as Palmtran, in trying to make Okeechobee corridor a more predictable corridor by optimizing signal timing. And we're looking at trying to optimize, utilize new technologies to do that. We're quite bullish on the fact that we think we can make some dramatic improvements in regard to timing on that corridor. We filed for a bridge opening application so that the bridge would, and I'm talking about across to Palm Beach, would not open during rush hour traffic. Transit routes to expand and optimize, and we have a consultant working on that right now, and we expect to be completed in the next few months with optimizing routes in association with Palmtran, who has hired the same consultant that we have. So we think we can make that seamless. And bike share, wayfinding, mobility hubs. We talked about the possibility of higher density surrounding a mobility hub that would promote transit. We're looking also at the tent site that was part of the RFQ to see what role the tent site would have in that mobility. We're looking at Banyan Boulevard, Tamarind, all of our downtown streets, to look at them becoming more complete streets and more safer and more enjoyable experience for people. We're looking at long-term Fern Street extension. We've got an application to extend that to improve our grid. Dedicated bus rapid transit is a very important one for us. And we've had numerous discussions with DOT and the county in regard to the implementation of that. As Gabe indicated, this could really be a game changer for us in regard to improving transit.
That's the one I keep pushing because I think it's probably the most easily done.
Yeah.
And I know Nick's sick of hearing me say, just take a lane on Okeechobee and do BRT east-west. Right? It'd be easy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The next one is, do we do our own application for transit as Helsinki did? You know, we've been in conversation with VIA talking about data. You know, we do know we want to be the central clearing place for all the data in regard to transportation within our city, because we feel that we should have the principal role in guiding that. So, you know, what does that look like? And that's something we're going to be working on. Tri-Rail Coastal Link, golly, that could be a huge game changer for us out in the suburban areas of our city, north-south, in regard to transit. Policies. So we're going to be coming back to the Commission on the 21st of May to ask through a resolution for you all to adopt this mobility plan, if you're in agreement with it, which would then set off a series of comprehensive plan changes, because in order to implement this, there would be plan changes both for the fact that there'll be different some land use implications, as well as the fact that if we want to look at a mobility fee, that it would require comp plan changes. There's ordinances, and then we're going to ask to adopt a Vision Zero policy. As Gabe talked about throughout his presentation, safety is our #1 concern. We're looking at adopting Vision Zero. There's only 2 other municipal governments in the state of Florida. We want to be the 3rd one and really adopt a plan that's based on what I call a 3-legged stool. It's both education, enforcement, and engineering. And probably the last one, engineering, is the one that we can control the most and really have a dramatic change in the way our roads are laid out. So we talked about demand-based pricing and parking policies, and I just mentioned mobility fee. You know, we need to look at how do we transition from an impact fee that's based on capacity for cars only to one that's based on capacity for all modes of transportation. It's very important that we focus our funding where on a multimodal solution for our city.
Excuse me, Scott. Commissioner James?
Thank you, Mayor. When you are coming back to us, can you also present to us the metrics? How will we define success? We're talking about data and making decisions based upon data. But as a policymaker, I want to make sure I understand what data we're looking at, what the metrics are, and then how frequently you will report to the Commission as to our progress in monitoring success. Can we expect that, please?
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
Some of the transportation demand management, as Gabe was saying, you know, we look at managing data, but there's other things that we can do. Parking cash out, we want to be the city to be the leader in parking cash out, to where we would encourage our employees not to drive their single occupancy vehicle to work, and we can create incentives. Unbundle parking. In future land use, do we really want to require that any developer that comes in has to provide parking within the same building, or do we want to end up having it to where if they have tenants that choose not to have parking, that could be sold separately? So you could choose between either having a parking space or not having a parking space within a particular building. Curbside management, you know, we know the technology is changing, and you know, we're looking at our policies for freight unloading, managing that curb, as well as drop-off for ride sharing. And As I mentioned earlier, we have the stakeholder working group, and I just saw the town of Palm Beach, the mayor, Caniglio, talked about that working group and the future of all of us working together to try to improve the Okeechobee corridor and other transportation corridors. So we feel we have a plan that we can be successful with. I think the future's bright. I have no doubts in my mind. So if there's any questions or if we can add any information, because as I mentioned, we'll be back on the 21st with a resolution, so we'd be glad to get with any of you all.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Gabe, for a really good job. I think we can get the lights if you don't mind. All right, what questions do we have? Commissioner James?
Thank you. A wonderful presentation. As I make my rounds and talk to people who either own buildings downtown or have businesses downtown, one of the things I hear, and perhaps they are not as far along on this process as we are, but they're saying we can't find parking for our employees, or as we are trying to attract businesses, we don't have enough parking spaces. And I know we say, oh, there's more than enough, but how do we respond to that? I mean, what kind of education or outreach program are we making to those people who are already downtown or their own land or buildings or trying to attract businesses downtown? How do we convince them that there is indeed enough parking and those businesses they attract will have parking for their employees?
Yeah, there's a couple. It's twofold, really, as far as what we see. The first one is that establish a hierarchy for parking downtown with visitors being on the highest point that we want to cater, obviously, to visitors.
You're not on, Scott.
Check.
Secondly, we want to price it properly so that people utilize effectively. And when I say that, what we want to do is encourage people to take more transit options and utilize our facilities less. That sounds kind of counterintuitive, but that if more people are taking transit, there's more space for our businesses, for their employees, and for those that need convenient, accessible parking. And you know, we just went through around.
I think the other piece is we have to look at fees. Right now, it's cheaper to park in our garage than to park your car in a condo. If you live in a condo and you need that extra parking space, you're being charged more. So people in downtown then park their car in our garage because it's cheaper than parking in a condo. So we need to look at that, you know, that kind of thing.
Also,
sorry I interrupted you, Scott.
No, that's fine.
Also, you know, I remember looking at the data and looking at the utilization of one garage versus another, and one would be very heavily utilized during the day and empty at night. One would be busy at night because there's a condo and empty during the day. And so I think there is an opportunity to look at shared parking over
Absolutely.
time. And that's what, I mean, like Nashville's been doing it for 20 years. It's been very effective. And actually when developers now rebuild a block, they're required to co-develop parking, or at least to look at that, which they want to do because it's cheaper. But I think you've done some analysis on the parking, haven't you?
Yeah, we looked at, you know, where the parking is being utilized downtown as a part of this effort, and it's really concentrated in a few places, and by pricing it correctly, we can smooth out that distribution of where it's getting used, but also line it up with the types of users that are parking. So someone who's parking here all day isn't using that space for someone who wants to come down and shop or go to a restaurant or something. They can maybe park another block or two away and walk. And so part of the strategy is looking at how you distribute that not only geographically, but also in terms of time of day.
Well, and just to add to it is that we've reassessed the parking situation in regard to who gets a parking space downtown in our garage. And you know, as I mentioned, the hierarchy is our visitors, but then second, our business, you know, people that work in our businesses, and then certainly we want to be able to provide a space for people who live downtown that don't have access to a garage in their building. But beyond that, we're going to restrict parking. Like, for instance, if you're a construction worker, you're not going to get a monthly parking fee, permit any longer. You're going to need to park somewhere else, and so that we can reserve it for the highest use of the park.
And right at this point, I've gotten those calls too. And right at this point, we do have spaces available. I'm directing them to Scott. He and Ed are working with them to find the spaces. We've just freed up 100 spaces. We're also freeing up some more in the police garage. It's not going to be right next door to your building. You're going to have to walk a block or two, but there'll be parking. Commissioner Ewing, you were next.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Brad and Gabe, for your presentation. So just first a comment and a question. The comment is, and I know it's one aspect of the overall project, but one that I think is really important, and that's the work that we're doing with the county, specifically on their deep dive regarding Palm Tran, and I know you mentioned that, and that we share consultants in that, so that it's more of a seamless end result, which I think is really, really important. The second thing is, when it relates to policies that have monetary impact, I can assume then that those decisions are going to be made here shortly, at least that first tier, as we go into 2018, 2019 budgeting. So is that how we're...
Yeah, our plan is to first make sure that we have support for the plan, the direction, and then we would bring changes to fees back over the next few months. Hopefully that we'll have those done in time for next year's budget. So we would incorporate them and bring them back to this body. So.
Just one more question. From an IT perspective, I noticed that on the 5 to 10 years, or post 5 years, the adaptive signalization was out. We don't believe that kind of technology can come before 5 years from now?
It's a good point. We probably need to get started on that sooner. We have a lot of things going all at one time. So, but it's a good point.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Ryan?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. I think you guys did a great job summing up the year's worth of work that has gone into it. As you know, it's always been something that I focused on the Dixie Highway corridor, and you've been focused on the downtown, and there's a whole lot of overlap in terms of taking the policies and moving them into other parts of our city in the North End and Broadway. And I wanted to say to Commissioner James's point that, the businesses contact us all the time and say, this scares us. We don't know that you're going to be able to roll this out. I can't go out and get employees. I can't, if I can't park them. But what I have learned is that, things are coming online. Brightline's coming online with their parking garage, Broadstone, and a lot of those developments have developed previously with shared parking concepts in mind early on. So there are things that are rolling out, which from my mind, the most important thing that you said today and what you need from us is that the city needs to be the lead in all of that coordination of transportation, transit, information, as Helsinki, I guess it was.
And it's very difficult we tried to work with the Kravis Center, for example, on shared parking, and they would hear nothing of it. But we have to keep focusing on that. We've got a gigantic parking garage at the convention center that's empty 99% of the day. It should be able to be used.
So to my point in that, what you're on the top, or in your first, left-hand side of the column, is the mobility fees and the replacement fees. Because, as these buildings are built and come online, it's really that last mile. It becomes the most difficult piece. It's got to be safe. It's got to be convenient. It's got to be protective in terms of, getting, torrential downpours. So as these parking garages are online, these policies of coordinating the last mile become most important for us to help you get that word out and work with the businesses and work from an economic development side and say, yeah, you want to bring 50 employees here, absolutely, you have parking if you need parking, but by the way, here's the Bright Line, here's the last mile, here's the coastal link, here's the bus.
And get businesses to incentivize their employees to take those things, yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things is that, you know, it's not our intention to take such a hard line because, you know, we're intending to bring policies in regard to parking maximums. But we know when you're trying to track Class A office space, and that's what we're trying to do. It's very important to our city to do that, that oftentimes the financing agencies require that they have a certain level of parking. What we're saying here is that if you provide above the parking maximums, you should mitigate that impact. And what would we do? Well, you know, we're looking at the possibility that if someone comes in and they want to park more than what the parking max is, that they could mitigate it and help pay for trolleys so that it would reduce congestion elsewhere. And so it would mitigate that impact. So, you know, we're not here to try to take a hard line and say, hey, look, we're just not going to allow people to bring their cars in. We're just going to make policies and incentivize you know, good practices.
And then over time, we can change the culture. I mean, in an ideal world, the employer that's incentivizing their employee with free parking would incentivize them with free mobility, maybe unlimited transit, a certain amount of Bright Line, bike sharing.
We need more choices of those, unfortunately, because I'm just thinking of our own employees. You know, I would be happy to do that, but there are not a lot of options on how to get to work in the morning.
Got to add options too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Commissioner Lambert, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I have another question, but I wanted to follow up on something you said, Mayor, and I'm curious. You mentioned having a hard time negotiating shared parking. What were some of the arguments against sharing?
We're Americans.
They're more pliable.
What is it? Sharing is caring?
Right.
Well, you know, the argument was that you know, our garages are already filled. You know, people use it all day. You know, in the case of the county, they're having problems with drainage, and you know, there's just always something. Yeah.
And my question is, you know, I'm interested to hear, well, first of all, I was glad to hear the community outreach, and that this is some of the largest attended events and most productive. I appreciate that. Thank you for taking the time to do that. What I hear a lot of feedback on is that Florida's different from other states, and so I'm interested to hear about Singapore. You said as a tropical climate like ours, you know, I love to bicycle, but I'm not sure, you know, in my suit that's what I would be doing. But, you know, what have you seen, and what are some speaking points to that?
Well, for one thing, every place thinks that they're different, right? Every place thinks that they're special, and in as much as they are, it's typically because of choices that they've made. Now, climate is a real thing, though. And air conditioning came online here in, the late 50s, early 60s, and it changed a lot, just like the roadways changed everything as well, right? So people have a certain expectation. But, yeah, when you go to Singapore, which is a great example of a very progressive government. Some people say authoritarian, but they've created a lot of great options for people. Now, they have their own challenges. You know, even though it costs about $50,000 to get a license plate, a lot of people buy them. And they have two different economies. They have the local and the expat. But without getting in, like going down a rabbit hole, they are looking really hard at how to make it more pleasant for people. And one of the things that they've uncovered is that more than anything, it's about shade. And I know that's something we talked about a lot here. We heard a lot from people. They said, hey, these palm trees look great. We understand that tourists expect them. But that's not what was here when I was a kid. You know, we had trees that actually provided shade. And so that, like these simple things, not that it's simple to fix, but these simple ideas may be some of the most important. Because otherwise, like in Singapore, they're going to build covers for all of their bike lanes and put solar-powered fans on them and this, that, and everything. But changing your tree infrastructure for the long term might be the easiest thing. The electric mobility, scooters, bikes, changes everything because you literally just don't sweat. Like if you're on a bike and it's electric and you don't even have to pedal when you don't want to, you don't sweat. In fact, you get a breeze.
Yeah. Mark Parks has an electric bike that he pops around in all the time.
And then culture change is the last thing, right? So one of the things I talked to them about in Singapore is, what if we ease up on the dress code, right? If people can wear shorts and a nice short sleeve collared shirt to work, that changes everything. So these are the types of things that they're looking at in places like Singapore. They also, one last thing, they give everybody a Fitbit. So if you live in Singapore, you get a Fitbit. I got one when I got off the plane 2 years ago. Everybody at the World City Summit was wearing a Fitbit.
I'm sure there's not tracking and all kinds of...
Probably.
Big brother.
Well, probably that,
But this is actually a great example of advanced TDM. So you get this Fitbit for free, and you're competing against everybody at the conference. So every room that you walk into, there's a score of who's got the most number of steps. And if you hit a basic threshold, they pay you $30 a week. The government pays you. But their healthcare costs are almost exactly half of what ours are per capita. So these things might sound a little out there, but they're definitely coming here soon. And we can drive it, or we can shape it, but we can't put our head in the sand.
Well,
Thank you. Yeah. I follow up, and then Commissioner James and Commissioner Shelf. You have a follow-up, Chris?
No, go right ahead.
You sure?
Yes.
Okay.
We can talk afterwards.
Commissioner Shelf, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. I think your concept of sticks and carrots is really interesting because I think any behavior is shaped by either reward or consequence, and I like that we're using reward. I think there's some very basic wins here, looking at things like signage, tree canopy. I know, Mayor, you've dedicated a lot of resources to increasing our tree canopy. And one of the things that I think is really important to touch on here, too, we talked a lot about visitors to our city, and there are some pretty significant impacts to citizens of our city, too. So I think one of the things that I know we've addressed outside of this process, too, are our commuter communities, making sure that things are safe for them. I've been a commuter in the city on a bicycle and driven down Okeechobee Boulevard during rush hour, and I think looking at the improved bike lanes and different things like that that help increase access to all of our communities are really important. One of the things we touched on too in the business community, looking at increased parking, decreased parking, but increased needs or perceptions of needs. I think one of the things that we should be cautious about is a backflow factor where we're trying to increase parking, and I think we've addressed that in a lot of situations by looking at flexible parking type situations where maybe today we have a parking garage, but there's a flexible interest in making ground floor retail if parking becomes irrelevant for developers throughout the city. So
that's what we're thinking about with the Banyan Hub.
Yeah. So I think those are the important things to look at, is what's good for today and what's good for tomorrow.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you. All right, Commissioner James.
No, I just want to reemphasize as we start moving ahead that we have some metrics in place, that we as commissioners, as policymakers, understand what those metrics are, and that we get a chance to monitor those on a relatively frequent basis, not only for us, but as for the public, so we can know where we're trying to go, what we're trying to accomplish. That's going to be very important.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Ryan?
No, I'll just move on because I think our next presentation is going to tie a lot of this.
We have a couple. We're okay. We're close. Any other questions?
Well, then I will follow up on Commissioner James' point of the metrics, because that's an interesting discussion in and of itself. What are the metrics that you're measuring? Are you have decreased pedestrian deaths, decreased accidents, increase of employers in the community, and what are the benefits in the health? And there's a lot of that stuff going on with this. So, we can say these specific data points will be measured, but there's also an intrinsic value that is very hard to really calculate. And I think that those are our overreaching policies, and then we figure out how we define the metrics for evaluating, because we do. We want to be able to shift as we learn things.
Yeah, and you know, the point I made before about making sure that in our downtown area, we have the ability to live and work, and you know, it goes back to having enough Class A office space. We have a ton of apartments coming online. Where are these people working? And if they can be working downtown, that cuts down the use of cars significantly. Additionally, I think we have to start thinking about those. If you haven't read the book Happy City, you should read it. It's really good. They talk about the near-in neighborhoods, streetcar neighborhoods, I think, that he refers to them as. But I think we need to start looking at those, too. You know, Grandview Heights, Flamingo Park, Northwood. How do we get those people into the city? And maybe it's expanding our trolley, but how do we get those people into their workplaces in the city without having to get into a car? And then sort of, again, back to the density. I think we have a lot of really good recommendations here, and I would like to ask my staff to take another look at the Okeechobee Business District and see if we can work this through, including the recommendations that are in the mobility study. We talked about getting the mobility study done beforehand. We're going to look at this and formally adopt it on May 21st. Let's look at how we can bring more jobs into our city by having more Class A office space. So, Rick, if you would work on that with your team and start. And I think we need to incorporate clearly what we've talked about today into those proposals to make sure that we're addressing parking, we're addressing mobility, we're addressing Vision Zero, and looking at the mitigating points that if somebody wants more parking, then they have to contribute to our trolley or whatever. So if you and your team would work on that, that would be great, and we'll work it through the system and see where we go from there. All right, thank you.